These days, it's easy to see people and animals competing over the landscape. Here's a photo of San Antonio Creek in New Mexico, where fences separate a ranch from a protected beaver habitat. You can tell the ranch land is almost bare, while the area behind the fence is lush with greenery. Here's what the landscape can look like when the beavers leave and their dams fall apart. Dry, cracked soil where there was a pond not long ago. To better illustrate the point, take a look at two sections of 7 Mile Creek in Utah. The one on the left belongs to the beavers, while the one on the right is used for heavy cattle grazing. So where am I going with this? As funny as it might sound, beavers have played an unexpectedly big role in American history. And the situation has taken a new turn recently. The result is mind-blowing. Is that good or bad? Let's figure it out. But first, I need some coffee. Just an unobtrusive reminder to hit that like button if you usually forget. And thanks for understanding my wish to stay anonymous. Let's be honest, for someone living in the 21st century, it's tough to imagine that the landscape was largely shaped not by some cutting-edge tech breaking mountains and rerouting rivers, but by beavers. But it's a fact. North America could just as well be called the land of beavers. For example, when researchers explored the Missouri River Basin in 1805, they found beaver dams, a ton of them. Experts figured that back in the day, there were about 250 million beaver ponds scattered across the continent, with enough water to flood Washington, Oregon, and California. Beavers have historically lived in areas stretching from northern Mexico to the southern edge of the tundra on the Arctic coastal plain of Alaska and northern Canada. By trapping sediment in their ponds, these animals unknowingly created fertile farmland across the northern half of North America. Back then, wetlands covered about 9% of the landmass of the continental U.S. But the animals just weren't ready for the hunters who arrived in New England in the 17th century and quickly spread west. By 1843, naturalist John James Audubon found that the Missouri River Basin was completely desolate. Most of the beavers had been wiped out by fur traders, and the survivors rushed to flee as far away as possible. Their disappearance transformed the waterways of North America. Streams and rivers started eroding their channels, forming deep ravines. Floodplains stopped spreading, and streams and rivers couldn't refill aquifers anymore. Some streams fed by groundwater dried up entirely. And yeah, people are to blame for this. Before the gold rush, there was the fur rush. Once nature's riches were drained in Europe and the Eastern American colonies, people went off in search of new treasures, different furs. The thick fur of the North American beaver was especially prized. It was traded for all sorts of goods and shipped all over the world. Of course, back then, nobody thought about the consequences, and the fur rush nearly wiped out the Canadian beaver. The scent glands that beavers used to mark their territory were even more valuable. The substance from them was used in perfume and even in cooking, though its use has declined in recent years. Whatever the case, all this ended in a sad result. According to researchers, by the start of the 20th century, only 100,000 beavers had survived, less than 1% of their historic population. Then, people put in quite a lot of effort to bring back the beaver population, but maybe went a little overboard. From incredibly valuable animals, beavers have turned into pests, though soon they might be in for another rebranding. Hold on a second, I'm getting ahead of myself. Here we have beavers. Beavers build dams. But why do they even do that? I mean, it's not like they're making nests like birds do. So what's the point of building something like that? For almost all animals, there's no point. Beavers are the only creatures aside from humans who create the habitat they need to survive. And if you've ever seen a beaver in real life, you'll understand that on land, life's not easy for them. Beavers, especially Canadian ones, can be pretty big, but they're clumsy, so they're easy prey for predators. And predators are well aware of this. Wolves, coyotes, bears, lynxes, and wolverines, they all go after beavers on land, and it's as simple as if the beavers were huge chicken nuggets strolling along the shore. No need to even break a sweat. But beavers realize how vulnerable they are. They build dams to stay safe. Since they need a deep water body for protection, why bother finding the right one when you can build it? It's quicker and more dependable. And while beavers are just creating the right conditions for themselves, they're changing the landscape around them. For example, let's take a look at how they affected Susie Creek in Nevada. In the late 1980s, Susie Creek was just a sliver of water cutting through a barren gravel bar. Nothing grew around here, and no one lived nearby until the beavers returned. Now willows and thick green grass grow here. All day long, the creek's channel is patrolled by muskrats, ducks, geese, white herons, mergansers, blackbirds, and sandhill cranes. There's even trout here. But what's way more important is that there's much more water in the creek and around it now. And this is especially important for local herders. The idea is simple. By splitting the creek's channel in half before the pond, a typical dam made of neatly stacked sticks blocks the weak flow and collects precious water, allowing it to spread out. Groundwater supplies are replenished, the dry soil fills with life, and even in dry years, the creek stays in place. Permanent water flows provide more water for wildlife and livestock and help protect local trout populations. If you compare satellite images with footage from 20 to 30 years ago, you can clearly see that the shoreline vegetation along Susie Creek has grown by more than 100 acres. The area of open water is expanded by over 20 acres, and the length of the wet creek is increased by nearly 3 miles. And there are now 139 beaver dams, whereas there were none before. Yep, all this beauty was created by the beavers. A similar thing happened in eastern Utah. There, in the middle of dry brush and dusty plains, a lush oasis now stretches along the Price River deep within a canyon. And if you stand by the river long enough, you might catch a glimpse of those who created this oasis. Of course, getting beaver populations to thrive in the desert landscape of Utah was a tough task for people. There had always been a severe water shortage here, and most of the river ecosystem had degraded. Year after year, things got worse, and wild animals, shoreline plants, and endangered fish species suffered from the lack of water. Well, how could they not? So people decided to bring beavers back here. First of all, they were really bold, and second, they focused on 2 rivers, Price and San Rafael, which run through some of the driest areas in eastern Utah. Actually, there were already a small number of beavers there, but it was clearly not enough, so they had to bring in more. Many of the beavers were taken from a university rehabilitation and relocation center, which traps pest animals all over the state. Before being released, they spent 3 days in quarantine to prevent the spread of invasive diseases, and they were microchipped with radio transmitters. A total of 47 animals were relocated, and the animals immediately got to work. And as you can see, they did a good job. Actually, even though beavers themselves probably wouldn't resist being relocated, it's really hard to do. Moving animals onto private land is possible, but it's a complicated process of getting permission, which is granted by the state, or not. It's a matter of luck. In some states, like Oregon, you need to get signatures from every landowner within a 4-mile radius of the proposed relocation site. If even one person is against it or doesn't say anything at all, that's it, no beavers. Because relocating animals without permission is illegal. But even once the signatures are in and everything's ready, you still need to deal with the beavers. Of course, they won't break free or run off during the move, but beavers are very territorial and don't always stay where they're relocated. There's a list of criteria when it comes to relocation, like making sure whole family groups are moved, not just individual animals. It's also important to move them in the right season and settle them within the same watershed. In fact, dealing with all this is easier than with bureaucracy. It was the paperwork that was a huge obstacle for groups advocating for the preservation of beavers and their return to their natural habitat. So who benefits from beaver dams? Actually, science is now rediscovering what Native Americans knew for thousands of years. They held the beavers' ability to store water in such high regard that they banned killing them. And they were right. The average beaver pond holds more than 925,000 gallons of water, and 3 times that amount underground, soaking up moisture like a sponge. This sponge is crucial during droughts to help restore river systems, and in times without drought, it soaks up floodwaters. It also acts as a giant filter when water seeps into the aquifer. Scientists call wetlands the kidneys of the river system because they not only clean the water of sediment, but also of pollutants like nitrogen and phosphorus, which can trigger toxic algae blooms. Beaver ponds are also called biodiversity soups because they're full of microorganisms that attract all kinds of creatures, from insects to migratory birds. Many scientists studying beavers' impact on ecosystems point out that their ponds are just as important for ecology as coral reefs. Research shows that when beavers are around, plant diversity goes up by 1/3, which leads to more variety in birds and fish. After that, otters, mink, and muskrats show up. In short, beavers build entire turnkey neighborhoods where everyone has a spot. They also changed the area along the way because they prefer to cut down broadleaf trees rather than conifers, which can create a halo of evergreen trees around the water. It doesn't really matter, but it looks interesting. What else do beavers impact? For example, forest fires. The ponds they create can act as natural speed bumps for the fire. When the vegetation's really wet, it just won't catch fire. Beavers' role in fighting fires has already been documented in Idaho. They became the main factor in reducing fire intensity along Baugh Creek during the Sharps Fire in 2023. Where active beaver dams were present, even local riparian vegetation was preserved. And don't forget, attracting beavers is way more cost-effective than building dams or concrete water storage tanks. At the very least, you don't have to pay the beavers. They'll just live their beaver lives, and they can even help mitigate climate change. By slowing down the water flowing off the snow, beavers can help streams stick around longer, which in turn keeps the habitat for fish and vegetation for cattle. Well, I've mentioned that already. And while the other states are successfully using beaver protection against fires and droughts, California's watching all this with interest. Lately, things have been getting pretty bad with the fires there. In 2020, the state saw 5 out of the 6 largest fires in its history. It's about time to turn to the beavers for help. This is what happened in December 2022. Beavers were released into the wild in California for the first time in almost 75 years. Alright, so actually beavers were first released into the Dottie Ravine Reserve. In 2017, it was a dry, dusty place with just a couple of sad trees, dried out grass, and severe erosion along the banks of a narrow stream. Then they let the beavers in, and the results were simply stunning. Now it's this lush green space with willows, poplars, and water everywhere. Instead of a single old stream bed, there are now several scattered across the landscape. Honeybees and other pollinators buzz around the wildflowers and local plants, herons wander through the shallows, and ducks splash in the deeper water. Pure bliss. And it's all thanks to the dams. Beaver dams are so effective that people even try to replicate them. This is Scott Valley, also in California, and it used to be called Beaver Valley. There used to be a lot of beavers here, and they did their job well. But then, as things go, the beavers disappeared with the dams and the wetlands dried up. Now Scott Valley looks like a post-industrial sacrifice zone, and the once thriving floodplain is now buried under heaps of mining debris. However, not everything is lost. Behind a pile of slag, a tributary called Sugar Creek turned into a pond as wide as several tennis courts with willows and alders along the banks. This oasis appeared thanks to the construction of what could be called the human equivalent of a beaver dam. People were felling Douglas firs, stripping the logs, driving them vertically into the creek bed, and weaving a mesh from willow twigs through the posts. Fortunately, a few beavers joined them later and reinforced the dam with branches and mud. I wouldn't be surprised if they decided to stay right there, just to show people how it's done. In fact, this stream restoration technology is becoming increasingly common. Federal agencies like the U.S. Forest Service, nonprofit groups, and even private ranch owners have set up structures to restore life to heavily eroded streams and, in some cases, help bring beavers back. In Wyoming, these artificial dams create wet meadows for endangered birds. In Oregon, they're restoring streams for salmon. In Utah, they're helping irrigate pastures for cattle. These beaver-style dams are cheap compared to other methods of restoration. Instead of spending over $1.5 million per mile of stream, you only need about $10,000. And in just a year, or at most 3, you can start seeing positive changes. But wait, what about the negative impact of beavers? They're often considered pests on the west coast of the U.S., and companies that handle animal control actively trap and kill them. And it's done on purpose. It's all because beavers flood roads, destroy trees, and of course this frustrates people. People lose money and run into lots of problems. The problem is that beavers prefer small uplands with a gentle slope of land. It makes it easier for them to control the water flow. However, these areas are usually densely populated by people who see the animals as a nuisance. Beavers flood areas and often fell valuable tree species. But there are ways to prevent damage. And no, it's not about killing animals. That doesn't lead to anything good. Alright, but what about the trees? If they're growing right by the shore, they really might need protection, and that can be done individually. Like wrapping a metal mesh around the trunk or putting up a fence. Or you can even paint the trees with a special paint to make it unpleasant for the beavers to gnaw on them. There are a bunch of humane methods out there that can help people coexist with beavers in the same area without resorting to exterminating them. After all, beavers can offer us priceless help, and they'll do it for free. And when someone is willing to do work for free that normally costs tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars, it's a good idea to be friends with them. Beavers to the rescue. Just a few more words about how beavers affect the landscape. Drone footage showed that the return of beavers to Devon had a positive impact on nature during the drought. In the past, people used to get rid of these animals by hunting them, but in 2008, they decided to reintroduce them to the river otter and study their impact for 5 years. The results exceeded all expectations. Beavers improved the ecosystem. Moreover, they were placed under protection to make sure no one would even think of disturbing them. So what's the actual benefit, you ask? I'm sure you've already figured it out. In the extreme summer temperatures, the areas populated by beavers turned into green oases compared to the surrounding lands. Plus, as expected, they've partly solved the problem of forest fires, where beaver families built dams, new wetlands formed, keeping the land submerged. Since beavers are territorial, when one area is occupied by other animals, they search for new spots along streams and ponds to settle, improving even more land. Oh, almost forgot to mention, thanks to the new wetlands, they help birds, insects, and plants thrive. They're building their own little neighborhoods. Well, you remember. Sure, there's another side to the beavers' busy work, so the rise in their numbers on the Otter River, like everywhere, needs to be kept in check, so people can also benefit from this kind of neighborly relationship. Biggest beaver project. Beavers love building so much that sometimes it's hard to stop them. In the northern part of Yorkshire, the animals got carried away and built a massive dam 230 feet long. By the way, this is the largest dam ever built by beavers in England, and it serves as a flood defense for the town of Pickering. Thanks to this, the 7,000 residents of the small town can relax. Even heavy rains won't threaten to flood their homes and businesses. They should really thank the beavers. Pickering used to suffer from constant flooding, which was messing up, well, pretty much everything. There weren't many ways to solve the problem. The environmental agency said it was impossible to implement an expensive flood protection system, so what was left to do? Of course, call in the beavers. Natural England and the North York Moors National Park Authority were in charge of that. With the beavers around, everything changed. The animals started dragging logs, branches, and mud into the River Severn, and after a while, they literally saved the little town. The flood control project was eventually approved, but if it hadn't been for the beavers, there would have been nothing left to save from the rising waters. Space Dam. Here's another beaver record. In Canada, a beaver family built a dam that's 2,800 feet long, which is twice the size of the famous Hoover Dam. The structure is so massive that you can even see it from space. The dam is located in Wood Buffalo National Park, about 120 miles northeast of Fort McMurray. Environmentalists discovered this impressive structure during research on the impact of climate change on permafrost using Google Earth satellite images. Interestingly, the dam has been around for quite a while. It appeared in images as far back as the early 1990s. At the same time, signs of beaver activity can be seen in images from the 1970s, so not only is the dam huge, but it's also old. But why did no one notice this giant structure? The thing is, the size of Wood Buffalo Park is bigger than Switzerland. Plus, it's a wildlife reserve where there are very few paths for people to walk on, so the beavers chose a place where humans hardly ever set foot. And that's why the staff of the national park only found out about the dam after a BBC film crew reached out to them. They were probably pretty surprised. By the way, someone actually managed to see the huge dam with their own eyes. An American, Rob Mark, wasn't afraid of the challenges and made the tough journey to get to the dam. And the journey was really tough. First, Mark took a boat to the shores of Lake St. Clair, but then he hiked 10 miles fighting through dense thickets, marshes that looked like swamps and mosquitoes, but he still reached his goal. Do you think the beavers were happy to see an uninvited guest? Nope. According to Mark, he was greeted by a very annoyed beaver. The animal slapped the water loudly with its tail, making it clear that humans weren't invited. I can't blame it. If I were that beaver, I'd be upset too. Unexpected weapon. How else could beavers be useful? For example, as a kind of weapon. Recently, an unusual criminal trend has emerged in the English countryside, secretly releasing beavers into the wild. One of the wildlife release programs is being carried out on the Yar River on the Isle of Wight, and the authorities have even called it a beaver bombing. And if you don't think there's anything wrong with it, especially considering everything I told you today, the authorities in England would disagree. In the UK, releasing beavers without approval is illegal, just like in the US. And it's all because of the flood risk. Plus, there are concerns about the environmental impact, including the spread of diseases among people and pets. But the truth is, people had good reasons to break the law. Environmental activists just got fed up waiting for official action to bring back the beaver population and decided to take things into their own hands. Now, beavers are freely roaming from Devon to Somerset, as well as in Wiltshire and Gloucestershire. To sum it up, the folks at Beaver Trust are urging the government to step in, since literally everyone's concerned about the droughts and wildfires. And since beavers help stabilize water flow during dry spells and floods, create habitats for a variety of other wildlife, and offer a cost-effective solution to several problems, this illegal action is actually for a good cause. Well, who's going to win in this showdown between farmers and activists is still up in the air, but time will tell. Time and beavers. You owe me a like. See you later.